The hunt begins. Alina watched the American rescue helicopters disappear into the night sky, carrying her 3 surviving teammates to safety. The sound of their rotors faded into silence, leaving her completely alone on the hostile mountain. She should have felt despair, but instead she felt something else entirely. A cold, focused determination that surprised her with its intensity. The enemy forces were regrouping after the helicopter crash, and Elena could hear their voices echoing across the mountainside. They were angry now, having lost so many fighters to a single sniper, and she knew they would not give up hunting for her. But that was exactly what she wanted. Every enemy fighter focused on finding her was one less threat to other American forces in the region. Elena took inventory of her remaining supplies. Her rifle was useless without ammunition, but she still had her sidearm with 2 full magazines, a combat knife, basic medical supplies, and enough food and water for maybe 2 days. It wasn't much to survive on in hostile territory, but she had trained for situations like this. More importantly, Elena realized she had something the enemy forces didn't expect: complete freedom of movement. They thought she was trying to escape, so they were setting up roadblocks and search perimeters designed to prevent her from leaving the area. But Elena had no intention of leaving. She was going to hunt the hunters. The crashed helicopter was still burning, casting an orange glow across the mountainside. Enemy fighters were surrounding the wreckage, some trying to put out the fire while others searched for survivors or salvageable equipment. Elena counted at least 30 fighters visible in the firelight, but she knew there were probably more, hidden in the darkness. Using the distraction provided by the crash, Elena began moving toward the enemy positions. She had abandoned her sniper rifle, keeping only essential gear that would allow her to move silently through the terrain. Without the heavy rifle and scope, she felt lighter and more agile, better suited for the close-quarters fighting that was coming. Elena's plan was simple but dangerous. She would use hit-and-run tactics to harass the enemy forces, striking quickly and disappearing before they could respond effectively. Each attack would force them to spread their resources thinner, making them more vulnerable and less organized. Her first target was an enemy observation post on a small hill overlooking the crash site. 2 fighters were positioned there with radio equipment, coordinating the search efforts and reporting to their commanders. Taking them out would disrupt enemy communications and create confusion about her location. Moving through the darkness required all of Elena's skill and patience. Every step had to be perfectly placed to avoid making noise on the rocky ground. She used shadows and natural terrain features to mask her approach, moving like a predator stalking its prey through familiar territory. Getting close to the observation post took over an hour of careful movement. Elena had to circle around several enemy patrols, waiting motionless in concealment while armed fighters passed within a few feet of her position. Her heart rate remained steady throughout the approach. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. When Elena finally reached the observation post, she could hear the 2 enemy fighters talking quietly as they watched the activity around the helicopter crash. They were relaxed, confident that any surviving Americans would be focused on escaping, rather than attacking. That overconfidence would be their last mistake. Elena drew her combat knife and moved behind the first fighter with practiced silence. The kill was quick and quiet, giving the man no chance to call for help or alert his companion. The second fighter noticed something was wrong only when Elena's knife found his throat as well. She quickly examined the radio equipment the fighters had been using. Most of the controls were labeled in a foreign language, but Elena had enough technical training to figure out how to monitor enemy communications. What she heard made her blood run cold. The enemy forces weren't just hunting for her, they were preparing for a much larger operation. From the radio chatter, Elena could tell that this had been the opening phase of a coordinated attack on American positions throughout the region. Dozens of similar ambushes were planned for the coming days, designed to eliminate American forces, piece by piece. Elena realized that escaping to report this intelligence might be more important than seeking revenge for her fallen teammates. Command needed to know about the planned attack so they could prepare defenses or launch preemptive strikes. But getting that information to friendly forces would require her to survive long enough to reach a communications point or extraction site. She was considering her options when the radio crackled with an urgent message. Elena couldn't understand all the words, but the tone was unmistakably alarmed. Someone had discovered the dead guards at the observation post, and now the entire enemy force would know she was still active in the area. Within minutes, Elena could see search teams spreading out across the mountainside, their flashlights sweeping back and forth as they looked for signs of her passage. The enemy forces were taking her seriously now, treating her as a significant threat rather than a survivor trying to escape. Elena decided to use their increased caution against them. Instead of trying to avoid the search teams, she would draw them into terrain where she held the advantage, then strike when they were most vulnerable. The mountain had dozens of natural choke points and ambush sites that she could exploit. Moving ahead of the search teams, Elena positioned herself near a narrow ravine that the enemy forces would have to cross to continue their pursuit. She planted her remaining explosive charges along the ravine walls, creating a trap that would eliminate multiple fighters simultaneously, while making it look like she had much more firepower than she actually possessed. The first search team reached the ravine just as Elena had predicted. 8 fighters moved carefully down the slope, their weapons ready and their attention focused on the shadows where a sniper might be hiding. They never suspected that the real danger was built into the terrain itself. Elena waited until all 8 fighters were in the ravine before detonating her charges. The explosion brought down tons of rock and debris, eliminating the entire search team and creating a landslide that blocked the ravine for any future patrols. The psychological effect was exactly what she had hoped for. The enemy forces would now assume she was heavily armed and extremely dangerous. Radio chatter exploded across the enemy communications network as news. Moving through the shadows, the mountain became a different world after dark. Elena had trained for night operations countless times, but this was different from any exercise or previous mission. Every sound seemed amplified in the thin air. The crunch of gravel under her boots, the whisper of wind through the rocks, the distant voices of enemy fighters searching for her. Moving down the mountainside required all of her skill and patience. Elena had to balance speed with stealth, knowing that her trapped teammates were running out of time while also understanding that one careless step could reveal her position to the dozens of enemies hunting her. She moved from shadow to shadow, using the natural terrain to mask her approach. Through her night vision scope, she could see the enemy forces had organized into search teams. Groups of 3 or 4 fighters were methodically checking every possible hiding spot on the mountainside, working their way toward her original position. They were disciplined and thorough, using military tactics rather than the random searching of untrained fighters. Elena realized she had perhaps an hour before the search teams would discover her abandoned sniper nest. Once they found it empty, they would know she was mobile and expand their search pattern. She needed to use that time to get close enough to help her surviving teammates before the enemy completely surrounded the area. As she moved through the darkness, Elena began to piece together what had really happened. The explosion hadn't been a simple booby trap. It had been part of a carefully planned ambush designed to eliminate American forces in the region. The enemy had probably been watching her squad for days, learning their patterns and preparing the perfect trap. The thought made her sick with rage and guilt. If she had been more suspicious of the easy mission briefing, if she had noticed more warning signs, maybe she could have prevented the disaster. But dwelling on what-ifs wouldn't help her friends who were still alive and depending on her. Elena paused behind a large boulder to observe the area where her teammates were trapped. Through her scope, she could see muzzle flashes as they exchanged sporadic gunfire with enemy forces. The good news was that they were still fighting, which meant they weren't seriously wounded. The bad news was that their ammunition would be running low, and the enemy was clearly preparing for a final assault. She counted at least 15 enemy fighters positioned around her teammates' location, with more arriving every few minutes. The Americans were holding a small cluster of rocks that provided decent cover, but they had no escape route and would eventually be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Elena studied the terrain, looking for any advantage she could exploit. The enemy fighters were positioned on higher ground around her teammates, giving them clear fields of fire but also making them visible to a sniper approaching from below. If she could get close enough without being detected, She might be able to create enough chaos to give her friends a chance to escape. The plan forming in Elena's mind was incredibly dangerous. She would need to get within 300 meters of the enemy, positions close enough that even a slight mistake would be fatal. But at that range, she could make every shot count and create maximum psychological impact on the enemy forces. Moving that close would require her to cross open ground that was probably being watched by enemy sentries. Elena studied the area carefully, identifying the darkest shadows and the routes that would offer the most concealment. She would have to move like a ghost, using every technique she had learned in over a decade of military service. Elena began her approach by crawling, on her belly, using a shallow ravine that ran roughly parallel to the enemy positions. The ground was rocky and uncomfortable, and every few meters she had to pause to listen for any sign that she had been detected. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure the enemy fighters would hear it. Halfway through her approach, Elena encountered her first major obstacle. An enemy sentry was positioned exactly where she needed to pass, a fighter with night vision equipment who was systematically scanning the area with his rifle. Getting past him would require perfect timing and absolute silence. Elena waited for nearly 20 minutes, studying the sentry's pattern of movement. Every few minutes, he would turn to check a different section of his assigned area, giving her a brief window when his back was turned. When the opportunity came, she moved like liquid shadow, covering 30 meters of open ground in complete silence. She was now close enough to hear the enemy fighters talking to each other in low voices. Most of the conversation was in a foreign language, but occasionally she caught English words and phrases. These fighters had been trained to fight Americans specifically. They knew American tactics, American equipment, and American weaknesses. From her new position, Elena could see her trapped teammates clearly. Jackson, Williams, and Chen were arranged in a small triangle behind the rocks, each covering a different approach route. They were conserving ammunition, only firing when they had clear targets. Their discipline was keeping them alive, but Elena could see they were almost out of options. The enemy commander, a replacement for the one she had killed earlier, was positioning his fighters for what looked like a final assault. Elena watched as he divided his forces into 3 groups, each assigned to attack from a different direction simultaneously. Her teammates would be overwhelmed in minutes unless she acted. Elena selected her first target, the new enemy commander. He was standing about 250 meters away, partially concealed behind a tree but occasionally exposing himself to coordinate his forces. Taking him out would disrupt the planned assault and buy her friends precious time. She steadied her rifle against a rock and controlled her breathing. The shot would alert every enemy fighter to her position, but it would also announce to her teammates that help had arrived. Helena centered her crosshairs on the commander's chest and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed across the mountainside like thunder. The enemy commander dropped instantly, and immediately the area erupted in chaos. Enemy fighters began shouting and firing in all directions, unsure where the shot had come from. In the confusion, Elena heard Jackson's voice calling out to his companions. "That's Elena. She's still alive. Get ready to move when I give the signal." Elena felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. Her friends knew she was coming for them, and they were preparing to make their escape. But first, she needed to create enough chaos to give them a real chance of getting away alive. Working quickly, Elena began picking off enemy fighters one by one. Each shot was carefully aimed and precisely executed, designed to cause maximum disruption to the enemy formation. Within 2 minutes, she had eliminated 6 fighters and forced the others to take cover or flee their positions. But Elena's position was no longer secret. Enemy fighters were converging on her location from multiple directions, and she could hear boots running across the rocky ground as they moved to surround her. She had bought her teammates some time, but now she was about to become the hunted, instead of the hunter. Elena made a split-second decision that went against everything she had been trained to do as a sniper. Instead of finding a new concealed position, she stood up and began running directly toward the enemy forces, firing as she moved. It was insane and suicidal, but it was also completely unexpected. The enemy fighters, who had been preparing to capture or kill a hidden sniper, suddenly found themselves facing a one-woman assault. Elena's bold move created exactly the kind of chaos and confusion she had hoped for, giving her teammates the opening they desperately needed to escape their trap. The impossible escape. Elena's desperate charge caught the enemy completely off guard. For crucial seconds they hesitated, unsure how to respond to a lone soldier running directly at their positions while firing accurately with every step. Those seconds of confusion were exactly what her trapped teammates needed. Jackson reacted first, understanding immediately what Elena was trying to do. "Move! Move! Move!" he shouted to Williams and Chen. The three soldiers broke from their cover and began running toward a gap in the enemy line that Elena's assault had created. Elena could see her friends moving in her peripheral vision, but she couldn't afford to watch their progress. Enemy fighters were recovering from their initial shock and beginning to return organized fire. Bullets whistled past her head as she dove behind a fallen log, her heart hammering against her ribs. From her new position, Elena could see that her teammates had made it about 50 meters before being forced to take cover again. They were in a slightly better position now, with more escape routes available, but they were still outnumbered and surrounded. The enemy forces were regrouping, quickly, adapting to the new situation with disturbing efficiency. Elena's ammunition was running critically low. She had maybe a dozen rounds left in her rifle, not nearly enough to fight her way out against the 20-plus enemy fighters who were now actively hunting her. But she had accomplished something important. Her friends were no longer trapped, in a hopeless position, and they had a fighting chance of reaching safety. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance made everyone on the battlefield freeze for a moment. Elena felt a surge of hope. Maybe American forces had heard the explosion and were coming to investigate. But as the sound grew closer, her hope turned to dread. The helicopters were coming from the wrong direction, and she could hear enemy fighters shouting excitedly in their own language. Enemy reinforcements were arriving by air, which meant the already impossible odds were about to become even worse. Elena watched in dismay as two military helicopters appeared over the ridge, their searchlights sweeping the mountainside. These weren't rescue aircraft. They were attack helicopters, armed and looking for American targets. Jackson's voice crackled, over a recovered radio, somehow managing to reach Elena despite the interference. "Elena, we can see the helicopters. We need to get to the extraction point now, or we're all dead. Can you provide cover?" The extraction point was a small clearing about 800 meters away, where emergency helicopters could land if American forces needed to be pulled out quickly. Getting there would require crossing open ground while being hunted by dozens of enemy fighters and 2 attack helicopters. It seemed impossible, but Elena realized it was their only chance. Elena began moving again, using every piece of cover available as she worked her way toward a position where she could provide covering fire for her teammates' movement. The enemy helicopters were systematic in their search, but the mountain terrain created blind spots that could be exploited by someone who knew how to move through rough country. As she moved, Elena counted her remaining ammunition one more time, 11 rounds in her rifle, plus 2 spare magazines in her pack. Against normal odds, it would be more than enough for a skilled sniper. Against the forces arrayed against her, it was almost nothing. Elena reached a position on a small ridge that gave her a clear view of the route her teammates would need to take to reach the extraction point. She could see Jackson, Williams, and Chen preparing to make their run, waiting for her signal. The enemy fighters were also repositioning, trying to cut off the Americans' escape route. She keyed her radio, hoping her friends could still hear her. "I've got overwatch. When I start firing, run like hell and don't stop until you reach the extraction point. Don't wait for me. Just keep moving no matter what happens." Elena selected her first target, an enemy fighter who was moving to block the escape route. At 400 meters, it was a challenging shot but well within her capabilities. She squeezed the trigger and watched the fighter fall. Immediately, her teammates began running. What followed was the most intense 2 minutes of Elena's military career. She had to provide accurate covering fire while enemy forces shot back at her position, all while the attack helicopters searched for her with their powerful lights. Every shot had to count, because missing meant one of her friends might die. Elena's training took over completely. She became a machine, calculating angles and distances automatically while her conscious mind focused solely on protecting her teammates. Enemy fighter after enemy fighter fell to her precise shooting, each death buying her friends a few more seconds to run toward safety. The attack helicopters finally spotted her when she was forced to change positions. One of them immediately swung toward her location, its machine guns chattering as bullets tore through the rocks around her. Elena rolled desperately away from the incoming fire, feeling stone fragments cut her face and hands. Through her scope, she could see her teammates had made it about halfway to the extraction point before being forced to take cover again. Williams appeared to be wounded, limping heavily as Jackson and Chen helped support him. They were running out of steam, and the enemy forces were closing in from multiple directions. Elena realized she had one chance to turn the situation around, but it would require making the longest and most difficult shot of her life. The attack helicopters was hovering about 600 meters away, its pilot maintaining a steady position while the gunner searched for targets on the ground. If she could hit the pilot, the helicopter would crash and create enough chaos for her friends to escape. Shooting at a helicopter was incredibly difficult under normal circumstances. The target was small, moving, and protected by armored glass. Add in the darkness, the distance, and the fact that missing would certainly result in her death, and the shot became nearly impossible. Elena steadied her rifle against a rock, trying to control her breathing despite her racing heart. She had 3 rounds left. If she missed with all of them, her friends would die and her sacrifice would be meaningless. Through her scope, she could see the helicopter pilot's helmet clearly, a small target that represented the difference between life and death for everyone she cared about. The first shot missed, passing just over the helicopter's cockpit. Elena adjusted for elevation and fired again. This shot struck the helicopter's windscreen but failed to penetrate the armored glass. She had 1 round left and the helicopter was turning toward her position, its machine guns preparing to fire. Elena took a deep breath and centered her crosshairs on the small gap where the pilot's side window met the main windscreen. It was a tiny target at an extreme range, the kind of shot that even expert snipers missed more often than they made. But as she squeezed the trigger, Elena felt completely calm for the first time since the explosion. The bullet flew true across the 600 meters of mountainous terrain and found its target. The helicopter immediately began spinning out of control as the pilot slumped over his controls. Elena watched in amazement as the aircraft crashed into the mountainside in a spectacular explosion that lit up the entire area. The destruction of the helicopter had exactly the effect Elena had hoped for. Enemy fighters throughout the area stopped, pursuing her teammates, and instead rushed toward the crash site, either to help survivors or to prevent the wreckage from falling into American hands. In the chaos and confusion, Jackson, Williams, and Chen were able to complete their escape to the extraction point. Elena heard the sound of American helicopters approaching from the east, real rescue aircraft this time, coming to pick up the survivors. She felt a moment of pure joy knowing that her friends were going to make it home alive. But that joy was tempered by the reality of her own situation. She was alone on a hostile mountain, surrounded by enemy forces, with no ammunition left, and no way to reach the extraction point before the rescue helicopters departed. Elena had saved her teammates, but in doing so, she had sacrificed any chance of saving herself. Alone in enemy territory, the silence after the explosion was more terrifying than the blast itself. Elena's ears were still ringing, and she could taste dust and smoke in the air, even from her distant position. She forced herself to breathe slowly and think clearly, despite every instinct telling her to panic or run. Through her scope, she could see movement in the smoke and debris. At first, she hoped against hope that some of her teammates had survived, but as the figures became clearer, her heart sank. These weren't American soldiers stumbling from the wreckage. These were enemy fighters, at least a dozen of them, emerging from hidden positions around the blast site. Elena watched in growing horror as she realized the full scope of the trap. The enemy hadn't just booby-trapped the building, they had positioned fighters throughout the area, waiting for the explosion to eliminate the main threat before revealing themselves. They had planned this ambush perfectly, accounting for everything except one detail. the sniper watching from the ridge. Her radio crackled to life, but instead of friendly voices, she heard enemy chatter in a language she didn't recognize. Somehow, they had captured American radio equipment, probably from her fallen teammates. The voices sounded excited, almost celebratory as they coordinated their next moves. Elena felt rage building in her chest, but she forced it down. Anger would get her killed and dead. She couldn't help anyone or get revenge for her squad. She needed to think like the professional soldier she was trained to be, not like a grieving friend seeking vengeance. She began counting the enemy forces she could see, trying to assess the threat. 12 fighters were visible around the blast site, but there could be more hidden in the rocks and trees. Most carried assault rifles, but she spotted at least 2 with rocket-propelled grenade launchers, weapons that could easily destroy her position if they located her. The smart play was obvious. Retreat quietly while she still had the advantage of concealment, get back to base and report what had happened. Command could send in airstrikes or a larger force to deal with the enemy presence. But as Elena considered this option, she noticed something that changed everything. Movement near a cluster of rocks about 400 meters from the blast site caught her attention. She adjusted her scope and felt her heart skip a beat. 3 figures, in American camouflage, were taking cover behind the rocks, and one of them was signaling desperately in her direction. Somehow, impossibly, some of her teammates had survived the explosion. Elena squinted through her scope, trying to identify the survivors. The distance and smoke made it difficult, but she could make out Jackson's distinctive red hair, and Williams was easy to recognize by his tall, thin frame. The third figure was smaller, possibly Chen or one of the newer guys. Her relief at finding survivors was immediately tempered by the reality of their situation. The 3 Americans were pinned down by enemy fire, trapped in a position with no escape route. Worse, she could see enemy fighters moving to surround them. In minutes, the survivors would be either captured or killed. Elena's training kicked in automatically. She began calculating distances, wind speed, and elevation differences. The enemy fighters were spread out over a wide area, some as far as 200 meters from her position. These would be some of the longest shots of her career, but she had made similar shots before under controlled conditions. The first target was obvious: an enemy fighter with an RPG who was positioning himself to fire at her trapped teammates. Elena centered her crosshairs on the man's chest, controlled her breathing, and gently squeezed the trigger. The shot was perfect, and the fighter dropped without knowing what had hit him. Immediately, the enemy forces began scanning the hills, trying to locate the sniper who had killed their comrade. Elena had perhaps 30 seconds before they pinpointed. Her muzzle flashed and began returning fire. She used those seconds to eliminate 2 more threats, dropping an enemy machine gunner and a fighter who was flanking her teammate's position. Bullets began striking the rocks around her as the remaining enemies opened fire on her position. Elena rolled to a new firing spot, knowing that staying in one place too long would be fatal. The enemy fire was surprisingly accurate. These weren't random insurgents, but trained soldiers who knew how to fight. From her new position, Elena could see that her initial shots had given her teammates a brief reprieve, but their situation was still desperate. Enemy fighters were regrouping and moving to surround the survivors from multiple directions. She needed to do something dramatic to shift the balance of the fight. Elena spotted what looked like the enemy commander, a man with binoculars who was directing the other fighters' movements. He was standing behind cover about 900 meters away, occasionally exposing himself to observe the battlefield. Taking him out might throw the enemy forces into confusion, but it would be a difficult shot with enemies actively shooting at her position. She steadied her rifle and waited for her opportunity. When the commander stepped out to signal his men, Elena held her breath and took the shot. The man collapsed, and immediately she could see the effect on the other fighters. Their coordinated movements became disorganized as they lost their leadership. But Elena's victory was short-lived. Enemy reinforcements were arriving, more fighters emerging from hidden positions throughout the mountainside. She counted at least 20 additional hostiles, and they were all converging on her position. Her teammates were still trapped, and now she was about to be overwhelmed by superior numbers. The situation was becoming impossible. Elena had maybe 50 rounds of ammunition left while facing dozens of enemies. Her radio had been damaged by the initial explosion, so she couldn't call for support. The sun was setting, which would make shooting more difficult but might also provide cover for movement. As darkness began to fall, Elena made a desperate decision. Instead of trying to hold her position against overwhelming odds, she would leave her secure spot and move closer to the enemy forces. It was insane by any tactical standard, a lone sniper moving toward multiple enemy positions in hostile territory. But conventional tactics weren't going to save her trapped teammates. Elena packed her essential gear and began moving down the mountainside, using the growing darkness and her knowledge of mountain warfare to stay hidden. Every shadow could conceal an enemy fighter, and every step could be her last. But somewhere in the darkness ahead, 3 of her friends were counting on her to do the impossible. As she crept through the rocks and brush, Elena thought about her father, who had taught her to hunt in the mountains of Colorado when she was a child. He had always told her that the key to survival wasn't having the best equipment or the perfect plan. It was never giving up, no matter how bad things looked. Tonight, she would put that lesson to the ultimate test. The sun was barely visible through the thick morning mist when Sergeant Elena Rodriguez checked her rifle for the 3rd time. Her hands moved with practiced precision, every motion automatic after 12 years of military service. The mountain air was cold against her face, and she could see her breath forming small clouds as she adjusted her scope. Elena had always been different from other soldiers. While most preferred the chaos of close combat, she found peace in the calculated silence of long-range shooting. Her record spoke for itself. 847 confirmed targets, each shot precise and clean. But today felt different. Something in the air made her uneasy, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. The mission briefing had been simple enough. Her squad of 8 soldiers was tasked with clearing a suspected enemy weapons cache hidden in the mountains. Intelligence reports suggested the location was lightly defended, maybe 3 or 4 hostiles at most. It should have been routine, the kind of operation they had completed dozens of times before. Captain Martinez had positioned Elena on a ridge overlooking the target building, a concrete structure that looked abandoned from the outside. Her job was to provide overwatch, picking off any enemies who tried to escape or reinforcements who might arrive. The rest of her squad would breach the building and secure whatever weapons they found inside. Elena settled into her firing position behind a cluster of rocks, her rifle steady on its bipod. Through her scope, she could see her teammates moving down the mountainside like shadows. Rodriguez was on point, followed by Jackson and Murphy. Behind them came Williams, Chen, and the 2 new guys, Foster and Blake, who had joined the unit just 3 weeks ago. The plan was flawless on paper. Elena would maintain visual contact with both the building and the surrounding area, while the assault team moved in. If anything went wrong, she was their lifeline, their guardian angel watching from above. Her position gave her a clear view of all approaches to the target, and at 800 meters away, she was close enough to provide accurate fire support but far enough to avoid any surprises. As she watched through her scope, Elena noticed something that made her stomach tighten. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt near the building, tracks that weren't in the surveillance photos from 2 days ago. Someone had been here recently, and that someone might still be around. She reached for her radio to warn the team, but before she could speak, Captain Martinez's voice crackled through her earpiece. "Overwatch, this is Bravo team. We're approaching the target now. Any movement up there?" Elena swept her scope across the area one more time. Everything looked quiet, almost too quiet. No birds, no movement in the brush, nothing. In her experience, that usually meant trouble was coming. But she had learned to trust her training over her instincts. And her training said to follow the mission plan. "Negative, Bravo team. All clear from my position. You're good to proceed." She watched as her teammates reached the building and took their positions. Martinez and Rodriguez flanked the main door while Jackson and Murphy moved to cover the back exit. The others spread out to secure the perimeter. Everything was going according to plan, exactly as they had practiced back at base. Elena's finger rested lightly on her trigger as she scanned for targets. The building had several windows, most of them broken or boarded up. If anyone was inside, they would likely try to escape through one of those openings when the assault began. She adjusted her breathing, slowing her heart rate the way she had been taught years ago during sniper school. The first sign something was wrong came when Martinez tried the front door. Instead of finding it locked or barricaded, it swung open, easily as if someone had left it unlocked on purpose. Elena felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to stay calm. Maybe the intelligence was right and the place really was abandoned. She watched Martinez signal to his team, then disappear inside the building with Rodriguez right behind him. Jackson and Murphy entered through the rear, while the others maintained their positions outside. For several minutes, everything was silent except for the wind whistling through the rocks around Elena's position. Then Martinez's voice came through the radio, tight with excitement. "Overwatch, we've got a major find down here. This place is packed with enough explosives to level a city block. We're going to need the demo team up here to dispose of this stuff safely." Elena felt a moment of satisfaction. The mission was going perfectly, better than anyone had expected. But that feeling lasted only seconds before Martinez's voice returned, this time urgent and worried. "Wait a minute. These charges are already wired. This looks like... Oh God, everyone out. Everyone out now. It's a trap." The explosion that followed was unlike anything Elena had ever experienced. Even at 800 meters away, the shockwave hit her like a physical blow, throwing her backward against the rocks. The sound was deafening, a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. When she looked up, the building where her friends had been moments before was gone, replaced by a massive crater and a mushroom cloud of dust and debris. Her ears were ringing so loudly she couldn't hear her own voice as she called frantically into her radio. "Bravo team, respond! Anyone please respond!" But there was only static, the terrible silence that meant no one was left alive to answer. Elena stared at the destruction through her scope, her hands shaking as the reality of what had happened began to sink in. 7 of her closest friends, men and women she had served with for years, were gone in an instant. The building hadn't been a weapons cache at all. It had been a carefully prepared trap, designed to eliminate an entire American squad. As the dust began to settle, Elena realized she was completely alone on a hostile mountain, miles from any support, with an unknown number of enemy forces who knew exactly where she was. The explosion had been so massive that it would have been visible for miles, and anyone in the area would now be converging on her position. She had 2 choices: try to escape and retreat to safety, or stay and fight against impossible odds. But, as she looked at the crater where her friends had died, Elena Rodriguez made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She was going to make the people responsible for this pay, no matter what it cost her.